Okay, so we're going to be talking about integer rules, which means adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing positive and negative numbers together. So I am going to go over book definition rules on how to do this, but I'm also going to give you my little twist on how to keep some of these straight in your head. So we're going to start off talking about how to add integers. Okay, so there's two different things that you need to be aware of when it comes to adding integers. Alright, so when adding, do notice every single one of these examples that I have up here is an addition problem. Alright, so you can have two different situations. You could be adding when they have the same sign, right, which means they're both negative or they're both positive. Or you can have the second situation where they're different signs, where one's positive, one's negative, one's positive, doesn't matter. But depending on which situation you have, it's going to tell you which rule to use. Alright, so when you have the same sign, they're either both positive, they're both negative, the rule says this. The rule says to add, which means add the numbers, keep the common sign. So if they're both positive, they're going to stay positive. If they're both negative, they're going to stay negative. Otherwise, add the numbers up. So the ones that have the same sign, like right over here, negative 8 plus negative 25. Same sign, so add the numbers. 8 plus 25, well, 8 plus 25 is 33, right? And keep the common sign. They're both negative, so your answer is going to be negative, right? So let's do another one here. Same sign, negative 64 plus negative 23. They're the same sign. That means to add 64 plus 23. So 64 plus 23 is 87. And since they're both negative, they're going to stay negative. So there I have a negative 87. Different signs, a little bit different here. So because they're different signs, the rule says this. The rule says to subtract the numbers, and we take the sign of the bigger number. So the way that's going to work is this. So if I'm looking at this example here, right, they're different. One's positive, one's negative. The rule says to subtract. And you always subtract the bigger number minus the smaller number. Right, so we don't do 2 minus 7. We do 7 minus 2. Alright, so 7 minus 2 is 5. And whatever number is bigger, 7's bigger than 2, we're going to take that sign. The 7 is negative, so I'm going to take the negative. If the 2 were bigger, I would have taken the positive sign. But the 7 is bigger and it's negative, so I'm going to take the negative right along with it. Alright, so over here, negative 13 plus 14, subtract them, right? Ignoring the signs, go ahead and subtract. 14 minus 13 is a 1, whichever one is bigger, so here 14 is bigger, it's positive, so this one is positive. Alright, so a different little twist on how to do this, I always say think about money, right? We're all familiar with spending money, using money. We know about, buying things, subtracting things, and, all that kind of stuff that comes with dealing with a bank account. Right? So think about that when you're dealing with this. If you had negative $18 in your bank account and you added $3 to it, where would you be? Now you would be higher, you'd be closer to 0, right? But you'd only be a negative 15 now, not a negative 18. If you were negative $18, you added $3, well hey, now you'd be at a negative 15. Works with the same thing. Different sign says subtract, 18 minus 3 is the 15, take the sign of the bigger. Same thing over here. If I had $19 in my bank account, but I spent $33, I'm now negative. And how much negative am I going to be now? Well, 33 minus 19, that's a 14. And I'm going to be down 14 because I spent way more than what I had in my bank account. Alright, so same thing works when you're thinking about spending money or if you're thinking about these integer rules. So let's talk about what happens when we subtract. Alright, so then let's talk about our subtraction rules when it comes to integers. So this is a little bit different here. So we have the same subtraction rule regardless what you're dealing with here, whether the same sign, positive sign. So think back to dividing fractions. When we divide fractions, essentially that rule just tells us how to change the division to a multiplication. Well, similar with this is our subtraction rule tells us how to take the subtraction problem and change it to an addition problem. That way we can use the rules that we just talked about. One other thing that you need to keep in mind when it does come to the subtraction problems here is this rule here, the double negative rule. The double negative rule comes up a lot whenever we're using subtraction, so it's very good to keep this in mind because it's going to help simplify things just a little bit more for us. So do remember when it comes to the double negative rule, if we have two negatives side by side, those cancel out and make a positive. So the first thing that I would do if I had several calculation problems like this is I would go ahead and go through the ones that have the double negative rule. For example, right over here at the top, I have this -7 minus -18. Because I have those two negatives side by side, I can go ahead and cancel those out and make them positive. Otherwise, this is an addition problem. We can use the rules for adding integers. Here I have different signs. It says -7 plus 18. So -7 plus 18. Well, different sign says subtract. 18 minus 7 is an 11. Take the sign of the bigger number. The 18 is bigger and it's positive, so I have positive 11 right there. Otherwise, next example, 20 minus 43. So using the book definition of our rules here, right? So 20 minus 43, book definition of the rule says that the first number stays the same, so 20 stays at 20. Change the minus sign to a plus, so this minus will now be a plus, right? And take the opposite of the second number. If the second number is a 43, then the opposite is negative 43. So opposite just says to change the signs. Right, so here I have 20 plus negative 43 now, which is adding with different signs, which means subtract, take the sign of the bigger. 43 minus 20 is 23. 43 is a bigger number, it's negative, so I'm going to take that negative. Over here, negative 42 minus 13, so let's think about this using the bank situation. If we were negative 42 in our bank account and we spent $13 more, well, negative 42, spending $13 more is going to send us further negative. So here, now we're going to be negative $55. Over here, $18 in our bank account and we spend $55. Right, so if we're positive 18, but we spend 55, we're now going to be, what, negative $37? Right, we're going to be down. All right, last example over here, we have negative 62. So let me separate this a little bit here. Negative 62 minus a negative 83. First thing I see is the double negative rule. All right, anytime we have two negatives side by side, they're going to cancel out. So that should be the first thing that we do there. Otherwise, a negative 62 plus an 83, using the rule, they're different signs, so that says subtract, take the sign of the bigger. So 83 minus 62 is a 21, and it's going to be positive since the 83 is positive. So let's talk about what happens when it comes to multiplication and division. Okay, so the multiplication and division rules for integers here is actually a little bit simpler than adding and subtracting. The rule is the same whether you're multiplying or whether you're dividing. So the rule says whether you're multiplying or dividing, if you have the same sign, it's positive. If you have a different sign, it's negative. Right? Otherwise, you just multiply, you just divide like you normally know how. So taking a look at our first example, 48 divided by 8, so I have the same sign. I know this is going to be positive. You don't need to write the plus, but sometimes I recommend to go ahead and put a little plus there at the end just so you do know you're looking at a positive answer. Otherwise, 48 divided by 8 is 8, right? So a positive 8 there. 50 divided by negative 5, so here I have different signs, so that means I'm looking at a negative answer. I would go ahead and put that negative there, that way you don't forget about it in the end when you're dividing. Otherwise, 50 divided by 5 is 10, right? So we have a negative 10. Negative 66 divided by a negative 6. Again, I have a same sign here. They're both negative. That means my answer is going to be positive. Otherwise, 6 goes into 66 11 times. So there I got a positive 11. Over here, I have a negative 72 divided by a negative 2. Same sign, so that means it's going to be a positive answer. Otherwise, 72 divided by 2 is a 36. Specifically, a positive 36. So here we've got some of our zero rules right over here. I'm going to erase some of these here just so I can use this for some space to talk about these here. So when it comes to our rules dealing with zeros, the thing that we need to keep in mind is this, right? So if we have 0 in the denominator, so A represents any number. If we have any number divided by 0, our answer is undefined. Whereas if we have 0 divided by any number, our answer is going to be 0. And let's talk about this for a second here. So for example, right, if I have 10 divided by, hold on, I'm sorry, that's not the example I want to do. So when it comes to checking division problems, so hopefully some of you do know this. If I have the division problem, 10 divided by 2. Now, hopefully we do know that 10 divided by 2 is 5. And the way that we can check our work is to sit there and backtrack and do 5 times 2 is a 10, right? So when we do division by 0 here, so 0 on top is equal to 0. So if I have 0 divided by 10, it would make sense that the answer is 0, because if we backtrack, we can go 0 times 10 is a 0, right? 0 times anything is 0. But if we do the other situation here, right, 10 divided by 0, the most common mistake is to say that this is 0. Right, but if we backtrack and we do 0 times 0, well, 0 times 0 isn't 10. That's not right. So then, okay, well, can you think of any number? Can I plug in any number here that number times 0 is going to get you a 10? Right, it's not going to work because regardless, you're multiplying by 0, and when you multiply by 0, it's always going to be 0. So there's just not anything that will ever work, which is why it's undefined. So when you divide by 0, it's always undefined. There's no answer for it. So when you divide by 0, it is undefined. But as long as 0 is up top, then your answer is 0. So it could get confusing on how to keep those in line and how to figure out which one is which. But do your best to maybe try and go back and multiply and check your work and make sure that you are doing it correctly. So otherwise, integer rules, multiplying, dividing, adding, and subtracting, they can get confusing, but for the most part, try and think about them in reference as money. Instead of maybe using some of these rules. The rules are very good to use, but for those of you that do get caught up with it, maybe the money explanation will help you instead.